All right. Hi, everyone. Let's see, how many are we so far? Just 15. Well, before we kick things off, we'll just wait another 5 minutes or so because, uh, well, 4 minutes now, because of course class does begin at 2:35 officially. So we'll wait for some more people to show up. In the meantime, let's get the slides ready. And let's share my screen. Oop. So today we're talking about substance dualism, which is a fun topic. Although we will have a little bit to say about property dualism toward the end of our discussion today. In the meantime, how is everyone? May not have got it just yet. Your email, I mean. Um, but I will respond after class or during the break. Anyone get a chance to see the Northern Lights on Friday? Very cool, huh? Yeah, I stayed up all night. So I'm still a little tired from messing up my sleep schedule. Um, but they were quite impressive. It wasn't the first time I had seen them, but it was the most active I've ever seen them. And it was quite cool. Even in Sandy Hill, on my balcony looking to the south, that's where I saw a lot of the activity, which is really impressive. Then I went for a walk around the block, probably around 3 or 4 in the morning, just so I could catch a glimpse of the northern sky, and they were all dancing across. But they went off really, really late. They didn't really get going until after midnight. So for those who missed it, sorry, I'm kind of an astronomy nerd. So for those who missed who missed it, we are entering the solar maximum period. So there's an 11-year kind of like sunspot cycle that the sun goes through, where it goes from like not very active at all to very active. And we're coming into the very active part where there's lots of sunspots, which generate these coronal mass ejections. And uh, it shoots all these ionized particles at the Earth, and they go through the magnetic field, get filtered down into the poles, and they ionize the gases in the atmosphere. So we get these beautiful lights. Well, it was all over the place, really. I read on the news that they were observed as far south as Puerto Rico. And in the southern hemisphere, they also got the aurora australis. So you could see those in Australia and New Zealand from the same event. So very, very cool. But again, we're headed into this period of solar maximum, so this could potentially happen again if you missed it. And sometimes you can see the northern lights when there isn't anything crazy going on. If you get out to a place with very little light pollution, um, and the conditions are favorable and you have a long exposure, you're able to take long exposure shots on your camera. You can sometimes even take photographs of them when you cannot see them with the naked eye. So that's cool. Anyway, just a little astronomy tip for you all before we get into the philosophy. And by the way, it's about time to get into the philosophy, so let's do that. So, mind is immaterial substance. This is, of course, chapter 2 in Kim's book. Let me just minimize my screen so that I can hopefully get a good thumbnail for the video here. So, Kim, chapter 2, mind is immaterial substance, or Descartes' dualism. So Kim starts things off by talking a little bit about the mind as soul, which is really, I would say, probably how human beings have understood the mind and the mental throughout much of recorded history, right up until the the modern period at least, and certainly in many religions and folklores, it is still kind of like the official story that the mind is the soul. In fact, the mind, not just the mind, but you as a person. Plato, for example, a student of Socrates and um, a teacher of many, including his most famous student, Aristotle, thought that to have a mind meant having an immaterial soul, a soul that is not made of the same stuff that the body is. And this is something that you see in a lot of major religions up to this day, including the big three Abrahamic religions, of course. You know, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the soul is this immaterial entity, which is let's just annotate this. The soul is this immaterial entity, which is essentially you. Um, so you don't so much have a soul, and I think Kim is very right to point this out. You don't so much have a soul or have a mind as you are a soul or you are a mind. And that's what Descartes argues is that he is not his body, he is his mind, which we'll see when we get to some of the arguments that we're going to look at later today. So if you're something like a Platonist or a Cartesian dualist, or if you are, say, a practicing member of one of the big three Abrahamic religions, you believe that the soul is immaterial, it's not made of matter, it is divine. Plato thought that the soul was divine, like in the sense that the forms are divine. That is incorruptible, perfect, imperishable, etc. The body is material, it's corruptible, and it's perishable. In fact, if you take a look at one of Plato's dialogues, like the Meno or the Phaedo, in both of those, you will find um, arguments for the immortality of the soul, namely the argument from recollection. Plato thought that we actually don't ever learn anything new, at least not with respect to the forms. Rather, we recall this knowledge from a previous encounter with them. And that happens when we're dead, when we're disembodied souls. Plato thought that the soul, goes and wherever the pure forms are in this sort of world of ultimate reality, and we're born, but because of the trauma of birth, we forget this knowledge. But by asking the right kinds of questions, which is what Socrates would do with his interlocutors, according to Plato, you can recollect this knowledge. Um, this is why, incidentally, Socrates always kind of describes himself as a midwife, like an intellectual midwife. He's not teaching, he's helping you give birth to ideas, the idea being that the ideas are already in there. He just has to help get them out. Kind of like a midwife helps a woman to give birth, right? So that's what Socrates sees himself doing, at least on Plato's presentation. And it gives us a nice picture of what Plato, maybe Socrates, but arguably Plato, thought about the nature of the soul as this imperishable, immortal, divine thing that is essentially you. So today we would call this mind-body dualism. And as I mentioned in one of my previous lectures, it is a very common folk belief or folk notion as well. And Kim also discusses this in this chapter. He says something to the effect that we are, we tend to think of the mind and body being very different kinds of things. This is a notion that comes to us very naturally, right? To use Susan Blackmore's terminology, the soul, when it comes to dualism, we're kind of like natural born dualists. Oh, geez, I've got a line in the middle of. Can I clear it? Yes. Okay. Get rid of that line. So yeah, we're kind of like natural born dualists. Plato is a dualist. We can think of him as kind of he's understanding the soul as a sort of spiritual substance. Um, Descartes, however, understands it as a thinking substance. So we call Descartes' uh, particular idea of dualism substance dualism, or sometimes Cartesian dualism. A little bit about Descartes, just because it's fun to learn a bit about the figures that we're talking about. Descartes is considered the father of modern philosophy, at least in the European tradition. See, Descartes is working at a time um, during the early modern period when um, science is beginning to become beginning, I got to emphasize that, is beginning to become a method of inquiry that works a little differently from philosophy, but it's not completely divorced from philosophy yet. People like Descartes were very interested in science and mathematics, or what we would call science today. Natural philosophy would be the term that Descartes and his contemporaries would have used. But he also was the sort of thinker who believed that you could come to fundamental truth, you could arrive at fundamental truths simply by exercising your reason. And that's why he's also considered the originator of rationalism. Rationalism is a branch of philosophy that says that the primary source of knowledge is reason, or the intellect. So we don't actually have to go and observe things like those empiricists. Rather, we can arrive at fundamental truths by thinking about things and by exercising our reason. Incidentally, he had this in common with Plato as well. Now, Descartes was born in France, but he spent a good deal of his adult life in the Netherlands because there was greater religious freedom. Descartes was educated as a Jesuit. Um, that is what's the full name? I believe the Society of Jesus or something like that. But basically, you can think of these guys as philosopher priests, right? They read scripture, they meditate, they go and do some philanthropic work, maybe, or they go and evangelize and apologize, etc., etc. And when Descartes published um, the Meditations, he dedicated it to the theology faculty at the Sorbonne because in that, Kim doesn't really mention this, but in that book, Descartes poses questions like, what if God isn't real, or what if God is a deceiver, which were blasphemous things to say. So he dedicates the book to the Sorbonne and writes this lengthy letter trying to declare that his intentions are not blasphemous and that he definitely believes in Catholic doctrine. And he still wound up getting his books banned by the Catholic Church. So greater religious freedom in the Netherlands for sure. He did not live to a very old age. He had a lot of famous students, one of whom was Queen Christina from Sweden. And he died at 53 while he was working as a tutor for Queen Christina. Queen Christina liked to have her philosophy lectures really, really early in the morning. And, if you want to imagine yourself in 17th century Sweden, it's cold, you're in an old castle, you're getting up at 4 in the morning, trudging up these stairs to the princess's chambers to have a philosophy lesson. You're going to get tired. You're probably going to get sick. And that's kind of what we think happened to Descartes, is that he came down with a very bad case of pneumonia and passed away at the age of 53. Had some interesting debates and lessons with Queen Christina, but also with Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, which we'll learn about later on in this very lecture. So, as Kim tells us, Descartes' dualism is not only a substance dualism, but an interactionist substance dualism. So we've got to talk about what a substance is. And there are various answers to this question that you'll find sprinkled throughout the history of philosophy. Aristotle, for example, thought that substances are something that exist independently. So I'm a substance, you're a substance, my desk is a substance. These are all things which exist independently. Those are substances. Another way to think of substances are as those things to which properties adhere. So if you think of something like well, let's go back to my cube example. So we think of my little Rubik's cube here. Um, it has various properties. Its faces can turn, right, like this. And its different faces, when solved, have different colors. So the way the sides and faces can turn are, properties. The colors are properties. It's cube shaped. So that's another property. It has these edges and flat surfaces. It has, let's see, it has 6 sides. And yeah, it's got lots of properties. But these properties need something to adhere to. The green, the orange, the red, the white, the blue, the yellow, the flat surfaces, these edges, these right angles in the corners, they can't exist on their own. They need a substance to adhere to. So that's another way to think of substance. Something that not just exists independently, but something to which properties adhere or adhere, as Kim says. So redness doesn't exist independently, for example. Redness needs something to exist on or within, needs a substance. Properties need substances. That's one way to think of it. And that's kind of the way that Descartes is thinking of it. The mind, for Descartes, or the soul, is a particular kind of substance. It is a thinking substance. Whoopsie daisy. Don't want to get ahead of myself. It is a thinking substance, or res cogitans. Bodies are a different kind of substance. They are res extensa, or extended substance. So Descartes believes that fundamentally what he is a thing that thinks, a thinking thing. He has a body, sure, but that body is not essentially what he is. Bodies, by the way, Descartes uses this term bodies. He doesn't just mean human bodies, he means any material body. Desk, table, chairs, this apartment, the cube, this coffee cup, these are all bodies. They are extended substance. They have mass. They take up space. As Kim says, they have bulk, right? Kim uses this word bulk, right? But they're made of matter. They're extended in space. They have mass. But the mind is not extended in space. It doesn't have mass. It's not made of matter. Fundamentally, what it is something that thinks. So that's the substance dualism aspect. But what about the interactionist aspect? Well, these two substances are supposed to interact somehow, right? The motions, the matter in motion, because remember, Descartes is a materialist when it comes to bodies, which is, if you recall, the historical forerunner of physicalism, right? If you're a materialist, you think that the world is matter in motion. So material things interact with one another and with the materials in our bodies. Matter in motion in the world affects our senses, for example. This affects the nervous system, and that affects the soul, causing our perceptions. And the thinking substance is also supposed to be able to affect material substance or extended substance. My beliefs and desires, for example, are supposed to be able to affect my body. So my intention to raise my hand is supposed to be what makes my hand go up. That's the idea. Descartes talks of these animal spirits. He doesn't mean, the souls of animals here. In fact, he doesn't think that animals have rational souls, non-human animals, that is. Rather, he means something like a weird kind of ethereal fluid, almost like a hydraulic fluid that is how he imagines our nerves work. We know that the nervous system and the muscles and everything don't work this way now, but this is kind of like the mechanistic understanding of the human being that we had during this period, during the 17th century. It was believed, and Descartes is not alone in this, right? Like Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher, who was an empiricist, is another materialist thinker, and he thought it was all matter in motion. Hobbes does not believe in a sort of immaterial soul. He believes that it's all just matter in motion, and we are kind of like um, natural robots. Um, although that word, he wouldn't have used that word because it didn't exist yet. Descartes follows him almost all the way, except that we have this immaterial soul. So these animal spirits are affected by things happening in the world. This is how the muscles and the nerves operate, and these sort of effects are carried in this causal chain up into the brain and then to the pineal gland, which is where the soul is supposed to interact with the body. It's like the locus of interaction with the body. The pineal gland, incidentally, is part of your endocrine system. So it's important for regulating, different hormones and things like that. But it actually turns out that it is not the locus of the soul-body interaction that Descartes thought it was. Why did Descartes think that it was the pineal gland? Well, it could be because the brain is kind of symmetrical, right? If you say you are conducting an autopsy on a cadaver, which people would have been doing back in the day, as we still do. But you're opening up your maybe you're an old-timey physiologist and you want to learn more about the human body. So you have a cadaver and you extract the brain, you start taking the brain apart, and you notice that it's symmetrical. We have these two hemispheres that are kind of like mirror images of one another. But there's a structure in there that is singular. It doesn't have a pair. This is not like a pair with one on either side. That's the pineal gland. So maybe that's why Descartes thought that the pineal gland was the locus of interaction between the soul and the body. So that's why we call this an interactionist substance dualism. We have two distinct substances. Moreover, these are each finite substances. Finite in the sense that, thinking substance can think, but it's not extended. It doesn't take up space. Material substance or extended substance can't think. They each do different things. They're fundamentally different kinds of things. There's another substance, infinite substance, for Descartes. And what does everybody think the infinite substance is? Care to take a guess?
The soul?
It's God. That's right. Well, the soul is thinking substance, but Jack is correct. In the Meditations, Descartes, when he's making his ontological argument for the existence of God, he says that, well, look, I'm a finite substance. I'm just matter with a soul, finite substance. But God is infinite substance. And then he goes on to argue that, how could I, a finite substance, conceive of an infinite substance? So, God must have put it there. So God must necessarily exist, right? It's an ontological argument. So there's finite substance, finite substances, soul, matter, and then infinite substance, which is God. This is one of the ways Descartes tried to, I think he is arguing in good faith for the existence of God, but by putting this argument in the Meditations, he's also trying to show, like, look, I don't actually believe God is a deceiver. I don't actually believe there's this evil genius who's deceiving me about everything. I do actually believe in God. Please don't ban all of my books. Please don't excommunicate me. Of course, his books did wind up being banned by the church. Any other questions about Descartes, his life and philosophy, before we dive into these arguments for dualism? Oh, four substances? Well, no, according to Descartes, we have two. And there are three that he talks about. The two finite substances, res extensa and res cogitans, so that's extended substance and thinking substance. and then infinite substance, which is God. So we have three that he discusses. Nonetheless, we characterize him as a dualist because of his emphasis on the thinking substance and extended substance. Aldwin, go ahead.
Hey, so for the extended substance, does Descartes mean that like our bodies are physical, so they're extended substance? Does that mean that it has to be connected to a thinking substance?
Doesn't have to be. In our bodies, we have we have a rational soul, according to Descartes, which is the thinking substance. Animals do not, non-human animals. So if you're a Cartesian, you will probably think of non-human animals as natural or created by God robots or automata. So animals can sense the world and they can move around in it. Descartes might have countenanced something like the Aristotelian vegetative and sensitive souls in animals, but not rational souls like we have. So bodies, like inanimate objects, are just
Mhm.
matter. Non-human animals might have certain aspects of soul, but then again, Descartes is getting away from Aristotelianism. So Descartes thinks of them as automata, which are the historical forerunners of what we would call a robot today. They're clockwork mechanisms. One thing, if you'll forgive the digression, one thing that really helps to make sense of the materialism of this time period um, is to remember that a lot of these natural philosophers, not just Descartes, but Hobbes, um, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, all the way up to Isaac Newton, think of the universe as a clockwork universe. They're deists, and that means that they believe in God and that God created the universe. But what God is kind of like a watchmaker. He makes the universe, which is this big, intricate machine. It's matter in motion that operates according to the laws of nature. So God makes the clockwork universe, winds it up, and then just lets it go. That's deism. So that's how Descartes is looking at the world. And everything in the universe for Descartes is kind of mechanical, except for the human mind. The human mind is a soul. So, yeah, he would say that at least when it comes to human beings, uh, we've got this thinking substance interacting with our material bodies. But that's not the case with animals or with inanimate objects. And first, so Hyla's question, finite substance is what is extended in space. Yes, but remember that thinking substance is also a finite substance, and it's not extended in space. So the finite substances are res extensa and res cogitans, and the infinite substance is God. So that's the way to think of it. Any other questions before we get to the core tenets of Descartes' dualism as outlined by Kim? Okay, looks like we're good to go. So these are the tenets of dualism, substance dualism, as Kim lays them out. There are substances of these two fundamentally different kinds. There are mental substances, so the soul or the mind, and material substances, and those are things, material objects, bodies, Descartes calls them. What is the essential nature of the mind? It is to think. It is to be conscious. It is to perceive, to imagine. Um, Anything mental is something that the soul does. The essence of a body, on the other hand, is to have a spatial location and spatial extension, a bulk, as Kim says. A human being is a union or a composite of mind and body. Minds are diverse from bodies. They're not identical with bodies, And minds and bodies can causally influence one another. So sometimes mental phenomena are causes of physical phenomena and vice versa. So sometimes my mental phenomena, maybe an intention to raise my arm, is the cause of raising my arm. Sometimes a physical phenomena is a cause of a mental phenomena. This light shining in my face causes me to perceive the lamp on my desk, right? So you see how it works. So you can see the dualism. You can see the substantive or substantial nature of that dualism. And I think you can see how it's an interactionist substance dualism. So again, these are the core tenets. This, by the way, is the kind of thing that would make an excellent test question. You know, maybe I ask you to put this in your own words, right? So when you see stuff like this on the slides, it's a good idea to kind of make a little mental note about its potential importance later. Now, in Descartes' most famous work, the Meditations, he uses something that we've come to call methodological doubt to work out what can be known with certainty. This is why Descartes is an important figure in the scientific revolution in Europe, because nowadays scientists use systemic or methodological doubt all the time, the scientific method, right? What Descartes does is he subjects all of his beliefs to doubt, even things that he thinks he is certain of. He doubts everything until he can arrive at some kind of indubitable foundation upon which he can build up all of his knowledge again. And this methodological or systematic doubt is, that methodology has lasted and been more like been further developed. And it's one of the things that helped science as we know it today emerge. There are a number of ways that Descartes doubts things. I'm surprised that Kim does not really discuss this, frankly. But Kim doesn't mention the dream argument or the demon argument. Is anyone familiar with either of these? Oh, my phone's going off. Yeah, anybody familiar with the dream argument or the demon argument? I wonder if anyone's encountered this before. We have a nope and a yes and another no. Well, no problem. That's what I'm here for. Okay, so I'm glad some people are familiar, but for those that are not familiar, Descartes is doubting everything, right? He wants to doubt everything that it is possible to doubt. Yeah, Thomas, that's I'd say is gesturing at the dream argument. You know, Descartes, when it comes to the what Descartes is doing with the dream argument is he's doubting knowledge from the senses. So, he says to himself, like, well, look, I'm sitting here by the fire, I'm meditating. I got my candle, I got my beeswax, because he's going to do the wax exercise in a minute. And he's thinking, and he's like, well, how do I know that I'm really here, by the fire, thinking about all the stuff I'm doubting? For all I know, I could be dreaming. I could think that I'm sitting by the fire doing philosophy when actually I'm asleep in bed. So that's the essence of the dream argument. The senses are not a secure source for knowledge because they can mislead us. I could be dreaming, I could be hallucinating, and not even. I might just need a new prescription for my glasses. I might be seeing a visual illusion or a mirage. Right? The senses are not reliable. That's the point of the dream argument. Um, the dream argument, I believe you can find in the first meditation. And by the way, you can read the meditations for free online if anyone wants to actually go and take a look at them. If you haven't read them, I mean, they're classic. And Descartes is such a cool writer. He takes you along on this meditative, imaginative journey with him. And it's fun to read, even if you disagree with the conclusions he reaches. So that's the dream argument. The demon argument is for not empirical knowledge, not knowledge from the senses, but for a priori knowledge, knowledge that you can arrive at just by thinking, right? Deductive knowledge. Things like all triangles have three sides, or 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? The supremely powerful, malevolent demon could deceive Descartes about these truths. In the Meditations, actually, he writes, there is a supremely powerful and cunning deceiver who deliberately deceives me all the time. Even then, if he is deceiving me, I undoubtedly exist. Let him deceive me all he can. He will never bring it about that I am nothing while I think I am something. So after thoroughly thinking the matter through, I conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, must be true whenever I assert it or think it. And that is the epistemic bedrock that Descartes is looking for. That's the thing that it's impossible for him to doubt. He can doubt knowledge from the senses. He can doubt a posteriori knowledge or empirical knowledge, knowledge from the senses. He can doubt a priori knowledge, that is deductive or rational knowledge, because maybe this demon is deceiving him. But even if he's being deceived, he cannot doubt that he exists. Because if there's this demon deceiving him, there's still got to be somebody being deceived. There still has to be somebody who mistakenly believes triangles have 4 sides or 2 plus 2 equals 5, right? And that's where this very famous phrase, the cogito, we call it, comes from. I think, therefore I am, or cogito ergo sum. That's the indubitable foundation upon which Descartes can build all of his knowledge again. And it's also the answer to what Descartes fundamentally is. Fundamentally, Descartes is a thinking thing. And he would say, you and I, everybody, all the people, fundamentally, what we are thinking things. We have a rational soul. We are a union of res extensa and res cogitans, right? Yeah, the demon is evil. Like he's and this is why Descartes got into trouble. Like he says in just prior to this passage, like God could make me believe that, you know, triangles have 4 sides or something like that. But God's not a deceiver. So instead of God, let's imagine this evil genius or this Cartesian demon who can deceive me about anything. The one thing he could never deceive me of is that I exist. He couldn't convince me that I do not exist because obviously I exist. I'm being deceived. So no matter how much this demon deceives me, for whatever evil, nefarious reasons he has, I can know with certainty that I exist. And that's the demon argument. That's how he arrives at the cogito. I think, therefore I am. And this actually appears also in Discourses on the Method. Meditations was written in Latin. Discourses contains many of the same ideas. It was published in French to be more accessible. You can read again. You can find both of these online for free if you're curious about taking a further look at some of this stuff. So Descartes does not believe he is identical with his body. He is fundamentally a thinking thing, and he believes that he can know his mind better than the body can be known. I'm just going to close my window because I live next to a school. It's an elementary school, and the children are out and they're screaming. So one moment. They sure do scream, these kids. When I was a kid, like we'd go out for recess and we had like, the indoor outdoor voice kind of thing happening. But kids these days, I don't want to sound like an old guy, but man, these kids these days, like it's like they have screaming contests with one another out there. It's pretty crazy. Anyway, um, so the mind is better known than the body. The body is material. The mind is non-material. It's a thinking substance. And Descartes thinks that what he fundamentally is his mind or his soul. Yeah, I'm not the only one who thinks this, eh? Like, yeah, When I was a youngin, we didn't scream like that even when we were outside. And we had to walk uphill both ways to school, you know? Actually, no, I had a bus. Um, okay. So the mind, the mind is better known than the body. Um, the body, this is very strong parallels to Plato, right? The mind or the soul is immaterial and imperishable, and the body is not. Um, Now we're going to get to some arguments for Cartesian dualism, and what I would like us to try to do is try and go through these arguments together to see what we make of them. So I encourage discussion. You can raise your hand and you can talk on video or with voice, or you can type in the chat, whatever you want to do. But I'd really like to get some discussion going right here because this is very important. One caveat, again, following Kim, these are not the arguments that Descartes actually presents. Descartes didn't formulate the arguments quite this way, but they are Cartesian in flavor. Um, this is why Kim uses the term Cartesian dualism throughout this chapter, right? All of these arguments are not necessarily the kind of thing that we find in Descartes, but they are sort of formulations, arguments that Kim formulates in support of the conclusions that Descartes is arguing for in the meditations and in the discourses. Go ahead, Taylor.
So when argument eight, I sort of like did that where I was like reading the Descartes point, then reading the Kim point, and I highlighted one of the arguments that she said. Oh, sorry, I think it's a boy, right? It's a man. Kim is a
Rene
man.
Descartes, yeah.
No, Kim. I'm pretty sure Kim
Oh,
is
Kim,
a.
no, Jaguan Kim, yeah, Jaguan Kim was a man
Oh,
from a
okay.
Korean American man.
Okay, sorry, I keep hearing Kim and I keep saying she.
Yeah,
Um,
no problem.
yeah, so argument eight is thoughts and consciousness exist. And then Kim provides us with, this sort of like argument where numbers are the sort of thing that can have colors like blue or red, or occupy a location in space, or be transparent. And I thought, like, what were ways that we could get around this? And one of the things I put was like, what if we draw a number three in red ink? Or what if we 3D printed one in blue ink? Like, what if there were ways that we could, like, I don't know, try to argue against Kim's points in favor of Descartes, um, because a lot of them I just find to be like really, he kind of goes maybe in circles, or maybe that's just me like reading him, where I'm like, those
Yeah,
philosophical questions, like I am that I am, always kind of made my head spin. So maybe that's just me.
yeah, fair enough. I mean, it's actually a good segue into the other thing that I wanted to say about these arguments. These are deductive arguments, right? And here, I'm just going to close the other window because those children are really loud. But one moment. Okay. So the point of an argument, like here, I'll just go to the next slide. A point of an argument like this one is that it presents premises and conclusions. Now, if the structure of the argument is logically valid, we don't break any of the rules of reasoning. And if the premises are true, that is, if the argument is sound, then the conclusion must necessarily be true. So when you're thinking of these arguments, yeah, you might deny some of the premises. You might say, hey, maybe I don't think numbers are the way Kim describes them, right? And that's possible. That's the kind of thing I want to do as we're going through these things. Incidentally, I think maybe the trouble with that argument, Taylor, is that Kim maybe seems to be presenting numbers like in a sort of Platonist way, where the number is not, if I can draw a number right here, right? Like here's the number two. Um, that's a representation of the number two, but it's not the number two, right? The number two isn't a physical thing, right? So maybe it's like the Ceci n'est pas une pipe, right? Magritte's treachery of images. We're talking about a representation instead of the thing in itself. right? But go ahead again, Taylor.
So then, like, just to like contrast what you said, like in theory, then numbers don't really exist because, like, tell me where the actual physical form of a number exists. If it exists within our mind, then is it even really a material? I think that's the word that they use,
Well,
material.
these are tricky metaphysical questions, right? Like, what are numbers? Do numbers exist? Or what kinds of things are numbers? Like, numbers might just be an abstract kind of thing and not a concrete kind of thing, right? So that's another way to think about it. But these are metaphysical arguments, right? We're going to start with the epistemic arguments. But although we will get to the metaphysics in a moment. But remember, epistemic arguments deal with knowledge. So remember from last time when we were going over our terminology, epistemology means something like theory of knowledge or study of knowledge, right? It comes from episteme, which means knowledge or certainty or understanding. And the ology part comes from logos, which is reason, true speech, logic. Yeah, it has a variety of connotations to it. So theory of knowledge, and this is argument one. Again, this is Kim's formulation of an argument in support of Descartes' conclusions. This is not something that Descartes actually puts together himself. But here's argument one. Premise one. I am such that my existence cannot be doubted. The I here, the ego, cogito ergo sum, is the mind or the soul. That's important to keep in mind. So that's premise one. I am such that my existence cannot be doubted. Premise two, my body is not such that its existence cannot be doubted. So conclusion one, therefore I'm not identical with my body. Why is my mind such that its existence cannot be doubted, but my body is such that its existence can be doubted? Yeah, Jill, that's pretty good. That's a good observation. I'm looking at my hand. Am I seeing my hand? Am I feeling my hand? Technically, no. This is all representations. If you're a representationalist, which I am, um, this is not my hand. This is a representation of my hand. Um, but that's one reason I could maybe doubt the existence of my body, right? Um, Remember, we learned last week that because mental states, like perceptions, conscious experiences, and so forth, are representational, it's possible for them to misrepresent, right? So I can doubt the existence of my body. Maybe I don't even have a body. Maybe I'm a brain in a vat, right? Like Hillary Putnam's brain in a vat argument. I might be just a brain in a vat in a mad scientist's laboratory, and he could be feeding my brain all kinds of electrical signals to make me think that I have a body. But actually, I'm just a brain in a vat, right? Michael says, in these arguments, I and body are treated as separate terms, and then there is a concluding regarding their separation. Isn't this using a dualism assumption to support dualism? Well, you've got to start with some assumptions, right? And one of the assumptions we're starting with is that kind of folk notion that minds and bodies are very different kinds of things. But don't worry about that for now. It's a good it's a good that you raised that, um remember, we just kind of want to get our teeth into these arguments and see what we make of whether the conclusions actually follow from the premises. The reason why we're going with this assumption, though, is because, think back to the demon argument. Descartes cannot doubt his existence. The one indubitable thing for Descartes is that he exists, and he is his mind, not his body, as the demon argument and the dream argument show. But the dream argument shows that he can doubt the existence of his body, right? He may not even have a body. Therefore, his mind, cannot be identical with his body. Therefore, the thinking thing that he is, his mind, is not identical with his body. Yeah, the brain and the vat is part of a body. But I think the point that we're trying to make here is owing to the distinctness of the mind and the body in terms of what we can doubt with respect to each of them, we can be pretty certain, if you're a Cartesian, that minds and bodies are distinct kinds of things. Now, not everyone's going to agree with this, right? Identity theorists are going to say, hang on a second, Descartes. Of course, your mind is identical with your body because mental states are just identical to brain states, right? So identity theorists are not going to be convinced by this, but a Cartesian might be. So good thought so far. So if you're moving to the person wouldn't be able to think, does that mean the mind is located in the brain and isn't the soul? Well, I think it's a category mistake to think of the mind being in the brain. But again, we'll get to that, right? I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. Jack says this argument seems to be really just asking about your metaphysical views. I see what you mean. Yes, there are some assumptions, as Michael pointed out. There are some pretty strong metaphysical assumptions baked into this argument, but it is primarily epistemic. It's about what we can know and what we can doubt about the mind and the body. That's why Kim treats it the way he does, as an epistemic argument, right? Does Descartes talk of his mind as the soul, not the brain? Yeah, that's what he's all about. The brain is a part of the body. The brain is just a mechanism like the rest of the body. It's the soul affecting that mechanism, which then affects the nerves and the muscles, right? So it's still all about the soul if you're a Cartesian. Yeah. No, Jack, you're right. Like I can, yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Remember, it's just one argument, and it's an epistemic argument. So you absolutely do not have to find this convincing, right? Um, as a matter of fact, I don't, right? I don't think, I agree with premise two. My body is not such that its existence cannot be doubted. I could totally doubt the existence of my body. Maybe I'm being deceived by an evil genius. Maybe I'm a brain in a vat. Maybe I'm in the Matrix, right? Like when Neo is pulled out of the Matrix and they're like fixing up all his muscles and stuff, um and Morpheus is talking to him, and Neo's like, why do my eyes hurt? And Morpheus is like, you've never used them before, right? Well, it's true. Like he's just been in this vat the whole time with electrical signals being plugged into his brain, right? So totally we can doubt the existence of the body. In this case, Neo has never actually used his eyes before, even though he believes that he has. It is, yeah, the body cannot be trusted. I mean, yeah. Especially like I feel that because I'm a very clumsy person. So sometimes I can't trust myself not to fall over on my face. But let's see. What do you mean when you say that if a premise sounds okay, that the conclusion needs to be true as well? Well, what I mean is that in a deductive argument, if the argument is logically sound, so it doesn't break any of the rules of proper reasoning, and if the premises are all true, then the conclusion has to be true. So if you want to disagree with this conclusion or these conclusions, what you've got to do is show, because this is a valid argument, or maybe it's not, I don't know. You've got to either show that the argument is not valid or that one of the premises is false. So when it comes to me, I agree with premise two. I can doubt my body, its existence, its nature. Of course I can. However, I do not accept premise one. I am such that my existence cannot be doubted. I can doubt the contents of my mind. Maybe we can just deny premise one. Maybe the self is an illusion, like the Buddhists think, or the bundle theorists, like Derek Parfit, Thomas Metzinger, those guys. Maybe I think there is an I, a continuous unified self, but maybe there's not, right? So I can just deny premise one. The premise and the conclusion are the same thing. No, what it means is if the argument is valid and sound, then what we say is that the premise, the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises, but they're not identical. In fact, when your conclusion actually features as a premise in your argument, we call that begging the question. It's a kind of logical fallacy. And Descartes himself actually does this in the Meditations. He begs the question. He says to himself, I have these clear and distinct ideas, and they're accurate and trustworthy, because God is not a deceiver. God is like the guarantor of my clear and distinct ideas. How do I know God exists? Well, I have a clear and distinct idea of God, right? It's a circle. It's a form of circular reasoning, right? So yeah, you don't want your conclusion to feature as a premise, because then you're begging the question. That is not logically valid. You're right. Jack, you're right. I don't want to be harsh. By the way, this class is kind of like a safe space for all kinds of different beliefs, philosophical and religious alike. And so I don't want to. I'm not trying to pick on religion. It's just that philosophy has a standard of certainty that's a lot higher than most religions do. That is why Descartes doesn't just, that's why he doesn't just go with scripture. He formulates arguments, not exactly like this one, but he formulates arguments to try and prove the things he wants to prove. It's not just a matter of faith for Descartes. It's a matter of reason, right? So that's that argument. I'm such that my existence, my mind, cannot be doubted, but my body is not like that. My body is not such that its existence cannot be doubted. So I can't be identical with my body because I can doubt the existence of my body. I cannot doubt the existence of the I, me, the ego. Therefore, I am a thinking thing that is not identical with my body. That's the argument. Oh, yeah, Taylor, I agree. They are fundamentally different. I just think that one of the ways that they're fundamentally different is the standard of certainty. In religion, especially Christianity, but in other religions too, emphasis is placed on faith, which is belief without evidence, or sometimes even evidence to the contrary. And philosophy just doesn't do that. At least we try not to. So it's different standards, different epistemic standards. Which is not to say, again, that there aren't religious people that try to be very rigorous. I mean, Descartes is obviously one example. Thomas Aquinas would be another example. Thomas Aquinas was an Aristotelian. Thomas Aquinas, he's so into Aristotle that he doesn't call him Aristotle. He just says the philosopher, like as if Aristotle's the only philosopher that matters, right? So if you're ever reading the scholastics like Thomas Aquinas and you're like the philosopher, who is that? It's Aristotle, because he's the philosopher. Like, he's the only one that matters. So what did we think of argument one? Are we convinced or not convinced? Oh yeah, my friend. Yeah, my friend, yeah. During the black metal concert. My Christian friend who's like, let's go to the black metal concert, and then gets freaked out when they say Hail Satan. This is a story from one of my other classes. I'll tell you all sometime. But it's kind of cool to have a Christian friend that you can go to a black metal concert with, right? It is fun. So Angelica disagrees to premise one. I'm sympathetic to that. Yeah, I am sympathetic to disagreeing with premise one. I'm a bit of a bundle theorist myself, which means that I think that what I call I or me, myself, is really something like an illusion. It's not that, when I say that myself or yourself or that selves in general are not real, I don't mean that they don't exist. I mean that they're not the kind of things that our everyday experiences lead us to believe they are. And denying premise one, if you've ever read Nietzsche, Nietzsche also kind of does this. He's like, Descartes, what does he know? I think therefore I am. Well, what if there is no I? What if that's an illusion? What about that, Descartes? Right? So that's something that Nietzsche picks up on, and that the Buddhists would also deny, because Buddhists deny the reality of the self, and bundle theorists in philosophy. So David Hume, Derek Parfit, Thomas Metzinger, thinkers like this would also deny premise one, arguably. Taylor says she can find issues with premise one and premise two. And yeah, maybe you can. I mean, maybe your body is not, maybe you don't doubt the existence of your body, right? Maybe there's some reason you can find that saves you from doubting the existence of your body in the way that Descartes does. On to argument two. So it sounds like we're not too convinced by the first argument. What about the second argument? Premise one: my mind is transparent to me. That is, nothing can be in my mind without my knowing that it is there. Premise two: my body is not transparent to me in the same way. Conclusion: my mind is not identical with my body. What do we think of this? Hey, Jack, yeah, it is quite bad, isn't it? Okay, a lot of things, a lot of good points here. Well, so for Jack, for Jack Yeager, I've got two Jacks. Okay, so Jack Y says, oh boy, the chat's really going off here. Okay, so transparency is not equivalent to identity, but transparency just means that I can know my mind better than I can know my body, which again we can deny, right? Jack R says it's quite bad. Yes, it is. Michael, that is an excellent point, and I was hoping that somebody would raise this. Aldwin and Sohaila and probably a few others rightly point out that the mind is probably not transparent, at least not completely. Yeah, exactly. The problem is we have this thing called the subconscious. Sigmund Freud is the first person to really articulate this idea, but you can find antecedents of it in Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. Maybe even arguably Kant, at least in terms of the structure of the mind. The mind has this innate structure that we're not really consciously aware of how it works. It just kind of works the way it does. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche talk about how we're driven by unconscious drives and desires, and then Freud comes along and articulates this in psychoanalytic terms. Nowadays, we talk about the cognitive unconscious, which are like automatic processes in the brain, cognitive and perceptual processes that we don't have conscious access to, right? I'll give you an example. All of you can understand what I'm saying right now, right? Especially, some of you might be speaking English as a second language, but I think this works whether you're speaking it as a second language and you're fluent, or if you're a native speaker of English like I am. All of you can understand what I'm saying right now, no problem at all, right? Now, how? Can you explain how that works? Like, explain what your mind is doing right now, understanding what I'm saying. You just kind of understand what I'm saying, right? And you don't have conscious access to the mechanisms that underwrite your understanding of the words that I'm saying. Right, but the actual steps, like you're right that information is coming in and the brain is processing it and so on. But the actual information processing steps, unless you've taken a neuroscience course, you don't know how that works. And you don't have conscious access to how it works either, right? So we could deny premise one. The mind is not transparent. Also, the body may not be transparent completely, but it's also not transparent. We know when we have pains and itches and things like this, right? We know when we're hungry. It's called interospection. Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say too, when I first read this, I thought that there maybe might be some kind of weaker, I guess, like form of this argument, where these exceptions you just reclassify them, right? Like if you say, oh, like pain is transparent to us when it occurs in the body, well, actually that's just happening in the mind, and it's kind of like, I guess, a weaker form of the argument, but that's just you're just begging the question, I guess, with that was what I realized. And yeah, I think
Yeah,
this one is just really terrible. Like I don't think there's really any way of reformulating it.
yeah, I agree. I think the problem is especially here the transparency claim with respect to the mental. Like there's so many things going on that I am not consciously aware of right now. Like when I'm even just doing this, this is an incredibly complicated thing. How am I doing it? I don't know. I'm just doing it, right? Um, so I personally I deny premise one. That's what I do. I suppose that's possible. I suppose that's possible. You could, but I'm not sure what premises we would need in order to arrive at the same conclusion. That arrive at this claim that the mind is not identical to the body. Yeah, maybe if they were completely transparent, would what would that mean with respect to identity? Or another point to be aware of is that nowadays philosophers of mind are really interested in something called embodiment. Cognition and perception does not just happen in the brain. It's we're embodied beings. We have certain kinds of limbs and so forth, right? That we use to think with. The very simple example is just counting on your fingers when doing math, right? Cognition is extended through the body into the world. Right. If you're somebody who thinks of the human being in this embodied, embedded, extended, and enacted sort of way, this is called 4E cognition, by the way. That's the idea that cognition is extended, embedded, embodied, and enacted. Then this question, is the mind identical to the body or not? Well, it's like we got to stop thinking that way. We got to get rid of dualism entirely, right? Because the mind and body are one unit rather than two different kinds of substances or something, right? So it sounds like we're not very convinced by this argument. If I'm following what everyone's saying, we're not very convinced with this one, and fair enough. I don't find it very convincing myself. How about the next one? Each mind is such that there is a unique subject who has direct access to its contents. Premise two, no material body has a specially privileged knower. Knowledge of material things is in principle public and intersubjective. Therefore, minds are not identical with material bodies. What do we think of this? I mean, at a surface level, this seems true. The mind is such that only I can directly access it. Your access to my mind is indirect. You have to listen to the words I'm saying or read my behavior, right? It's only I who have direct access to my own mind. But bodies, like remember, bodies doesn't just include your body, but it means material objects in space, don't have privileged knowers. In principle, knowledge of them is public and intersubjective. You know, anyone can come and look at my cube, right? Even if I lock it away in a safe so that no one can look at my cube except me when I want to, in principle, it's the kind of thing that anyone could come to know about because it's there in the world. But my mind is not. What do we make of this argument? I mean, Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, I worry that some of the same things are happening here, where these exceptions where there's instances where we have, I guess, intersubjective knowledge of things that are happening in our body um, are kind of just associated with the material, and then the instances where they're not are just associated. Like it's kind of I feel begging the question a little bit and just assuming these different categories and then kind of using that within the premises, and it just I don't think it's as terrible as the previous one, but definitely just seems a little bit problematic, I guess.
Yeah. And again, like I see where you're coming from, and I think this is probably partially in, this is kind of intentional, because Kim is certainly not a dualist, not a substance dualist. In fact, there are not really very many serious substance dualists these days. I would say I think the problem, just like with the last argument, is probably with the first premise. Um, yeah, well, Michael, that's a great point. Why do we have psychiatrists, right? Um, and Thomas, the brain in the jar, right? Read the brain waves and we can find out anything about the mind. Yeah, I guess if we have complete physical knowledge, maybe, although some people would deny this, right? It depends whether you're a physicalist or not. Um, I would say, look, I would say, yeah, that's a good idea. Cases of hypnosis where maybe the hypnotist makes you forget something, right? Um, so yeah, these are all really good examples. I think the problem with this argument is the first premise, just like with the last argument. So a unique subject who has direct access to his comments, maybe this is a little bit less strong of a claim, right? Like I'm not oh wait. I mean, my mind is transparent to me, like fully transparent. Well, no, it's definitely not. But each mind is such that there is a unique subject who has direct access. Well, there is a unique subject, maybe, unless you're a bundle theorist, but direct access to all of its contents, maybe not. Yeah, that's a good. Okay, so all of these are really great examples. So let's go through these. So Michael says, why do we have psychiatrists? It's true. Why do people go to therapy? Well, the therapist helps them to understand perhaps why they are behaving the way they are. And they might not know that. The patient might not know that, right? Let's say, there's a patient, let's say we've got like an alcoholic who's trying to quit drinking, and they want to understand the reasons why they drink. They don't know why. They're just like, I just drink, glug, 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 right? Maybe the therapist helps them understand that they drink as a trauma response. They don't know that. But the therapist helps them come to that realization. And now that they know that, they can try to drink less or something, right? The hypnotism example, right? You can plant a hypnotic suggestion in people. It's really funny, actually. People will confabulate. They'll make up reasons why they do things when you give them hypnotic suggestions. So let's say that I hypnotize you and I say, when I cough twice, you're going to get up and open the window. So then we're talking, and I go, and you get up and open the window. And I say, why'd you open the window? You'd make up a reason. You'd say, oh, it's just so hot in here. When really it was a hypnotic suggestion, right? So that's called confabulation. Aldwin has a really good one, multiple personality disorder. In some cases of multiple personality disorder, or what we now call dissociative identity disorder, um, somebody could have an alter or alters, and they might not know what the alter knows. They might not remember what the alter does, right? So there are lots of examples where we can think of minds as not having direct access to their contents. Lots of examples. Yes, that's right. So DID, it's not that it's doubted. I mean, we know that these cases happen. The question is whether DID is merited as a diagnosis as opposed to something else. Everything from a fugue state to outright fakery, right? Or to different kinds of schizoaffective disorders. Like, it's not like these things don't happen. The question of treatment is complicated. The question of the diagnostic label is complicated as well. Hypnotism is real, but hypnotism doesn't work the way a lot of people think that it does. Hypnotism is not magic. Hypnotism is simply putting somebody in a kind of sleepy, suggestible state. And not everyone can be hypnotized. I have never been hypnotized. I don't think I can be. I have seen people being hypnotized, and oh boy, there are some hypnotizable people out there. Kim, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question. If you could repeat the word that you used to describe the action that the like it was I forgot what you said specifically, but it was a term that described the person that makes up a reason as to why they did like a hypnotic suggestion. Do you remember that the
Yeah.
word that
Yeah, so Hyla got it. Confabulation. It's just there in the chat. And by the way, Kim, or Sahila, it depends what you mean. Like, isn't accepted by psychology? It's not really used as in treatment for various things anymore, and that's because it can cause false memory syndrome. So it's not that it doesn't work. It's not that it doesn't happen. It's that it doesn't work for treatment. And we know this from all kinds of interesting cases. Everything, all of them have to do with recovering memories. There are people that, earnestly try and use hypnotism to do good things in treatment, like recovering memories of childhood trauma, in particular sexual abuse. And then there are fairly weird ones like recovering memories from alleged past lives or recovering memories from alien abduction. And in all of these cases, what we find is the hypnotist unintentionally implants false memories in people. So when it comes to getting abducted by aliens, this is fairly innocuous. But when it comes to something like childhood sexual abuse, this has the potential to do a lot more harm than good, right? So hypnotism is a thing. Whether what psychologists doubt is whether it ought to be used in treatment for anything. And also, it's like I said, it's not magic. I can't hypnotize you and make you do whatever I want. That's not how it works. It's really just giving you a suggestion. And if you're suggestible enough and tired enough, you'll do it. Again, I saw, yeah, I'm not sure about that, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's correct. And of course, there are lots of other claims about it, like, use it to quit smoking or something, which I doubt works. I doubt you can use hypnosis to really quit smoking. I saw this one episode, man, back in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s. There was this show called Ripley's Believe It or Not. Associated with the museums, right, where they put all the weird stuff. Like I went to the one at Niagara Falls and they had a chair that was for the world's tallest man, and it was like a giant chair, a huge chair, right? The Ripley's Museum. They had one clip on this show, one little bit that highlighted a dentist who used hypnosis instead of anesthesia when doing people's teeth. And I thought to myself, that is so unethical. Like those poor patients getting their teeth drilled with no anesthetics. Yikes. Like that's torture. That's not dentistry, that's torture. Yeah, the placebo effect is kind of like how hypnosis might work, right? But anyway, I saw this hypnotist. EDMR can be used in therapy to help uncover. You know what? I don't know what that Kim, can you explain that a little further? What does that term refer to?
I believe it's eye movement, like desensitization and reprocessing. It's kind of like I know it's like new. I've heard of it before. It's kind of like a therapy where like you use like your eyes and like focus on a specific thing to kind of help you solely focus on your memories. I don't think I explained it that well, but I just know that like it is like offered in like newer psychotherapies and stuff like that for processing their memories and things of that nature.
Interesting. I'm not familiar with it, so it sounds like maybe it's trying to do something similar to what hypnotism used to be used for, but yeah, I'm just not familiar enough to comment on it. But I just before we move on to the next slide, there was once a hypnosis show that I went to in was before undergraduate actually. I think I was in college at the time. Um anyway, it was one of those raunchy hypnotists, right? He called himself a triple X hypnotist, although there was nothing pornographic happening. But he would do these little tests to see who would be a good candidate in the audience for hypnosis. And he's talking like, you are getting sleepy, like really low, really spooky voice. And I'm just sitting there watching it. This guy beside me, like, it took about a minute. This guy beside me, he's up on stage, the hypnotist, you're getting very sleepy, your limbs are becoming tired, and your eyes are heavy. This guy passes out. He just passes out. He's standing up, he just falls backwards, and some other guy has to go and catch him. Like, very hypnotizable, I guess. But that didn't happen to me. I just enjoyed the show. Psychedelic use for therapy. Well, I'm not that kind of doctor, but from what I know of the research, it does look pretty promising. So we're talking psilocybin, we're talking MDMA in some cases, and ketamine in some cases, even though those latter two aren't really psychedelics. They do have psychedelic effects when administered in certain ways. And these could be good for certain things. It seems like that they may be helpful for helping people with PTSD, maybe with addiction as well. And that has to do with the effects they have in certain parts of the brain. But obviously, a lot more research has to be done because, there are cases of people, tripping on ayahuasca and murdering somebody, right? Like, I'm not going to say that if you do a psychedelic, you're going to go and murder someone. But I'm saying that you have to be careful, right? We're still in the early stages of actually understanding, scientifically how this stuff works, because a lot of, for years and years and years, we couldn't study this because, these are controlled substances, right? So I think it's promising. I think certainly lots of research still needs to be done. I'm obviously not a medical professional, so none of this is medical advice. If you are really curious about this kind of thing, you should speak to a physician. But I do believe, just on the research side of things, that that there is a lot of promise to this. So let's look at a problem with epistemic arguments before we take a little break. So Yeah, we're almost an hour in. So we will do this slide, and then we'll move on to take a break and do the metaphysical arguments. Now, Kim points out a problem with using epistemic arguments. It's hard to use them to try and differentiate things on the basis of the nature of knowledge, right? Here's what Kim says. I'm just going to read you this part from page 38. To show that X does not equal Y, it is necessary and sufficient to come up with a single property, P, such that X has P but Y lacks it, or Y has P but X lacks it. X lacks. Anyway, such a property P can be called a differential property for X and Y. The question then is whether epistemic properties, like being known with certainty, or an intentional property like being believed to be such and such, can be used as a differential property. So what do we think? Do we understand what we're talking about when it comes to differential properties? Again, these are all logical variables, right? X, Y, these are objects. P is a property. We could fill in anything we want to make this a little more concrete. So give me two objects. I just need two objects. Any two objects. I know. Hang on 1 second. Okay. X and Y, two objects. These are my two objects, my guitars. So let's call my pink one X and my blue one Y. All I have to do to differentiate these two objects is to come up with one property that one of them has and the other does not. I could say, for example, that Y here is blue and X is not. So that's sufficient to differentiate them. Y is electric. You can see here, see, it's upside down, but you can see here, it's an electric guitar, and this is not. So they are two different things. X and Y are different. So that property, being electric or being blue instead of pink, or being acoustic and being pink instead of blue, these are differential properties for X and Y, right? Of course, these have a lot of other things which differentiate them, right? But just to make the example very simple, the properties which do differentiate those two instruments are the differential properties that we're looking for. Yes, it is, Jack. It's a Gem Junior, actually. It's not the expensive one. It's the affordable one. I believe it's made in Indonesia instead of Japan. But it is the price difference does not reflect the quality difference. It is a very, very playable guitar. I actually use it to play the blues a lot. You can get some really nice stratty tones out of it. Anyway, differential property would be color. Yeah. No, color works, right? Color works. Imagine if I had two cubes. I think I do have another cube around here somewhere. I just don't know where it is. But let's say I had two cubes, slightly different colors. Like they have red and green and yellow and blue, but they're different shades or different tones. Maybe I have this cube and then I have a cube with pastel tones instead of these bright tones. Those are differential properties as well. And if I can just show that X and Y, one of them has a property that the other lacks, then I've met the necessary and sufficient conditions to differentiate them because I've identified this differential property. The question here is whether epistemic properties like being known with certainty or being transparent can work as a differential property. Can anyone think of an example of when it won't work? Jack, go ahead.
I think the example that Kim uses in the book, I think is about someone who's committed a crime. and he's driving a certain car, I think.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, this person is driving this car, and it's known to the police that he's driving this car, but someone else knows him and doesn't know that he owns this car, so it
Yeah.
wouldn't be the same individual. It wouldn't be identical, but clearly he is the same person,
Yeah.
uh, regardless of kind of our understanding of him. So
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's the example he uses. It's I believe the driver of the black SUV did a hit and run or something. And so he's known to the police as that person, but not known to Kim as the person, even though they're the same person, right? I also like those opacity examples, when we talk about the opacity or opaqueness of beliefs, right? Um, like Clark Kent is known to Lois Lane as Clark Kent. Superman is known to Lois Lane as Superman. But Lois Lane does not know that Superman is Clark Kent. But they're the same person, right? And you can use any number of examples, right? At least before that climactic scene in The Empire Strikes Back, uh, Luke Skywalker knows Darth Vader as Darth Vader. He doesn't know him as Anakin Skywalker. He thinks Anakin Skywalker was betrayed and murdered by Darth Vader. However, he does not know until, I don't want to spoil it, but you know where I'm going with this, right? Oh, maybe. Yeah, spatial location could be a differential property, absolutely. Because two things can't be in the same space at the same time. So I would say, yeah, it can be a differential property. What do you mean if something is unknown or unconscious? Like, I'm not sure what you mean, Sohaila. Oh, yeah, I agree. Yeah, definitely. It is. It is. Because, like I just said, right? Use any example you want. The driver of the SUV, Superman and Clark Kent, Batman and Bruce Wayne, Walter White, Heisenberg, Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader. There are tons. There are tons we could come up with. Which show very effectively that in these cases, epistemic properties they don't differentiate individuals, right? Jack, good point. Yeah, Frege, I should say, on identity claims. Frege said that there are there's two things happening here when we use different words for the same thing, right? You can have a referent, that's the object your word refers to, but you can refer to it in different senses. And Frege's example is Hesperus and Phosphorus, which are two different names, the morning star and the evening star. But both of these just refer to the planet Venus. So they have the same referent, but Hesperus and Phosphorus refer to it in a different sense, right? And Kim actually does talk about identity claims later on in the chapter when he talks about necessary identity. But we're not going to worry about necessary identity today because then you got to get into like Kripke and all that stuff, and that's a little too heavy for today. But do we all see the problem with trying to differentiate X and Y using epistemic properties? Doesn't really work, does it? Right? What do we think? Doesn't work. Disagree with me if you want. By the way, I like when students push back on me. I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to tell you how to think. So you can, if you don't agree, that's cool. But it seems to me, and I imagine it seems this way to a lot of you, that epistemic properties might not be able to do the work we want them to do here. That is, differentiate between two different things. Oh, I see. Yeah, like if you're looking at two balls, like a red ball and a blue ball, or two balls that are the same color. Yeah, two balls that are the same color. So let's say you have two red balls, and you're seeing them both, and you're like, well, I can clearly see both of them. I can know that they are two different things and they're not identical with one another because I'm observing them simultaneously. Yeah, I guess that works. But otherwise, maybe this only works under very limited conditions. Anyway, why don't we take a little break and then we'll get on to the metaphysical arguments. Well, yeah, I mean, I think so. Just not the epistemic ones. Then again, I can come up with counterexamples, right? Like, how do I know that two people are not identical? Well, maybe they have different memories, but I could then rewrite one of their memories. Oh, not only physical. Okay, yeah. Yeah, because with this we're getting into complicated questions about personal identity, and those are tricky, right? They're a little bit about outside of the scope of what we're talking about today, but yeah, no, it's a very good question. Okay, so let's see, what time is it? We are at 4:06. So why don't we come back around 4:16, 4:17, something like that, and then we'll try and get through these metaphysical arguments. Okay, I will pause the video recording now, and I'll see you all in about 10 minutes. All right, so we're back. Let us continue. I had to re-up on the coffee. So we're going to look at metaphysical arguments next. Remember, again, as discussed previously, metaphysical arguments deal with, the kinds of things that exist and what they're like. In this case, we're talking about minds and bodies and what minds and bodies are like, right? You can also think of metaphysics as the study of reality, which is, I think, is a helpful way to think about it. So we're going to find arguments like this one, argument 4, where the first premise is that my essential nature is to be a thinking thing. My body's essential nature is to be an extended thing in space. So the body and the mind have a different essential natures. They're different substances, right? And again, yes, the dualism is kind of baked into this, right? But don't worry about that. So by virtue of premises 1 and 2, my essential nature doesn't include being an extended thing in space like the body. Rather, my essential nature is to be a thinking thing. So the conclusion that follows is that I'm not identical with my body. Since I'm a thinking thing, a mind, my mind is not identical with my body. What do we think? Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, these definitely seem, I think, to be more contingent facts. Like you say there's something about conceivability. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but it definitely does seem, I guess, conceivable that uh, it could be otherwise, I guess. Like we definitely can imagine other possible worlds in which this isn't the case.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess that to me kind of undercuts this whole argument.
Yeah. Again, I don't think we're meant to find these very convincing because, as I said before the break, Kim's whole point is to try and show us why substance dualism doesn't work and why so many philosophers don't take it seriously. I mean, there are dualists, but dualists nowadays tend to be property dualists, not substance dualists, right? And is my essential nature to be a thinking thing? I don't know. Maybe. Is my body's essential nature to be an extended thing in space? I mean, I think what I'm gesturing at when it comes to the conceivability argument is, if you think back to what I mentioned about philosophical zombies, whether you can conceive of something um, that is physically identical to me in every way. but which lacks consciousness, if that's conceivable to you, then sure, you're going to like this argument. But if that's not conceivable to you, so what? Right? Non-Cartesian substance dualism. Yeah, well, like that would be like Plato. Plato would be an example of that, I think. Michael's talking about premise 3, my essential nature. What does the scope of my mean? He means, well, what is meant by here, my essential nature, because on dualism, on substance dualism, you're taken to be your thinking substance, your mind, your soul, not your body. The me means your mind, right? Yeah. I mean, there are different formulations of this argument that you find when we talk about, um, say, the metaphysics of identity. Um, you could be identical. You could be identical with something and still not be that thing. You could be identical with the things that constitute you. Like I am identical with all of the atoms that constitute my body, but I am not just those atoms. Because, imagine if I had like a bucket of all the atoms that I'm made of. I load it up with all of the water and calcium and iron and whatever, and I just mix all of the chemicals that make my body up into a bucket. Well, that's not identical to me. That's just a bucket of stuff, right? Conceivability is whether you can plausibly imagine and countenance some possibility. So basically, does it make sense to you? Like, if I say to you, there could be a creature that's physically identical to you, down to every last atom, that's not conscious. Some people would say, oh, yeah, that makes sense to me. That's the body, but it lacks a soul. But other people would say, that's not conceivable to me. Anything physically identical to me must also have identical mental states. That's not conceivable to you. So that's what a conceivability argument is about. So I guess, are we convinced by that argument? It seems like maybe we're not, which is kind of the point, right? Is anyone convinced by that argument, the previous argument? People are quiet. Well, I mean, if we go back, you can deny one of these premises, right? And that might be why it wouldn't work. If you accept these premises as true, it seems like a sound argument, but you can deny that your essential nature is to be a thinking thing. You can deny that your body's essential nature is to be extended in space, right? How about this one? Argument 5. If anything is material, it is essentially material. However, I am possibly immaterial. That is, there is a possible world in which I exist without a body. Hence, I am not essentially material. Hence, it follows that I am not material. What do we think of this one? This one's tricky because this is what we call a modal argument. That is, it deals with possibility. So it deals with what's logically possible and not what's logically necessary. So what do I mean by logically possible? I mean that things could have been otherwise in another world, another reality, if you like. We're not talking about physically impossible, right? Like, for example, there's no logical impossibility to going faster than light, but it's physically impossible to go faster than light, right? There's nothing within reason that says that you can't go faster than light. It's just that the universe is not set up that way. So you can't do it. Just physically, you can't do it. Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, I think premise two is kind of the problematic one here. I mean, you've talked about embodiment and stuff, and that's probably a good way of talking about it. I mean, I think that we kind of do need our bodies to exist. And I think later when we talk about the pairing problem and all these kind of causal issues, it becomes pretty clear that like, yes, our bodies are kind of necessary for our existence. And yeah, we can't really differentiate from people if all we have are immaterial souls.
Yeah. And Jill raises a good point here. This also relies on this premise that you know, or relies on this idea that, maybe my existing without a body is conceivable, but not possible. But do you mean physically impossible or logically impossible? Because what we want is if we buy this argument, it has to be logically possible for there to be a world where I could exist without a body. So we're not talking about physical impossibility. Remember, we're talking about logical impossibility. So premise, just to answer this last question, conclusion one, well, these two conclusions follow from these two premises. Yeah, it might mean that if it's logically and physically possible, that would mean the soul survives death. And maybe even something like Plato said, that the soul exists before birth too, right? Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, I think my rationale for disagreeing with premise two, I think it's in a paper called Lonely Souls, also by Jaegwon Kim. But he talks about the fact that basically if we invoke all these rules about causation, there could be only one, I guess, immaterial soul. So, I mean, I guess I could exist without a soul, but then no one else would exist. So I don't know. It seems this argument kind of I'm more partial to it than the others, but it still seems flawed, I guess.
Yeah. Like what is it if minds are just, and I think Kim will talk about this later in this chapter as well, but um if souls are just thinking substance, then what differentiates them, right? That's a problem that dualists have to contend with. And I think Kim is not convinced of the ways in which they deal with that problem. So do we think that there's a possible world? Is it conceivable that there's a possible world in which I can exist without a body? Okay, so Aldwin says yes. How would that work? Yeah, how would we perceive anything? If the soul is immortal. Okay. So if it's logically possible, if this is logically possible, then maybe it follows that I'm not material. But again, there might still be a little bit of a conceivability argument happening here. You could deny that there is a possible world in which you exist without a body. You could simply deny premise two. Yeah, maybe you can exist without a body if you're uploaded into a computer somehow, if that is possible. I would say, though, that in that case, the computer is just your new body, right? Because here we're talking about a mind with no body at all. Like no body at all, just a disembodied mind. Yeah. So I guess it depends what you mean by body, but again, I'm using body in the Cartesian sense. We tend, when we hear the word body, we think, oh, like my body, but we mean any body, any physical body at all, right? Which I take to include a computer or a robot. So yeah, if you upload me to a computer, the computer is just my new body. Yeah, it reminds me of those people that say they see ghosts, right? I talk about this a little bit in my paranormal class, but if the argument is that the soul is immaterial, then how on earth are these ghost hunters, going in with their EMF meters and their cameras and whatever they've got? How are they finding anything? Because yeah, it's magic. Because if ghosts are souls and souls are supposed to be non-physical, then how do they affect anything in the world? Right? So whenever I see these ghost hunters and they go in and they've got all this equipment that looks scientific, they have EMF meters. These are electromagnetic field meters, and it goes like woo, and they think that's a ghost. Well, okay, so are ghosts electric now? Well, that means they're physical. So come on, you either believe in an immaterial soul or you don't. So these ghost hunters, their metaphysics, it's hopelessly confused. Their metaphysics. Is premise one restricted to this world? Well, yeah, I mean, it's not. It's not. It's not restricted to this world. It's saying like, yeah, immaterial means no body at all. Nothing material or physical at all. It'd be a completely different kind of thing, a completely different kind of substance, right? And remember, one of the ideas we can use to understand or make sense of this idea of substance is independent existence. So, and that's the idea, is that if the mind is a different kind of substance, it can exist on its own without a material body. That's the idea. And this is trying to show that by saying there could be a possible world where we're all just souls with no bodies. So it follows from that if such a world is logically possible, then I can't be essentially material. That's what this argument is showing. Makes sense, right? I mean, when I say make sense, I'm saying you understand what the argument is trying to do, correct? I'm not saying the argument works. I myself would just deny P2. I say, no, there's no possible world in which I exist without a body. I'm just not impressed by that premise. Like, get rid of it. And when you take it out, the argument falls like a house of cards. But what do we all think? Are we done with this argument? Are we okay with moving on to the next metaphysical argument? All right. So the next one, suppose, if you will, that I'm identical with this body of mine. In 2001, this body did not exist. Why? Well, I'm technically not made of all the same molecules that I was in 2001. I've gotten a little older. I've been eating and drinking and growing in the meantime, such that none of the matter that makes up my body now is the same matter that made up my body in 2001. So it follows from this that I did not exist in 2001. But I did exist in 2001, didn't I? Yes, I did. In case you were wondering, I did exist in 2001. It's a bit like the ship of Theseus. You guys know about this, the ship of Theseus thought experiment? So if you know of it, let me know. If you don't, also let me know. Who's never done this thought experiment? Because it's fun. Okay. All right, we'll do it. We'll do it right now. It's a very old thought experiment. It goes way back to ancient Greece. And there are various versions of it. But here's the story. You got this guy Theseus, who is kind of like the legendary founder of Athens. And he was a sailor. So he had this awesome boat, or a ship rather. and he's sailing around the Aegean Sea in his ship. He's founding Athens. He's saving the youth from Crete or wherever, right? So it's decided that we've got to turn Theseus's ship into a museum, make it a museum ship. They have these ships now. I've never been, but I've always wanted to go. You can go to a museum ship, and it's just an old ship. They have like old sailing ships. They have like battleships, and you can just go wander around the ship, and it's its own museum. So they want to do that with Theseus's ship. But the problem is that over time, planks start to rot, ropes become tattered, and so we have to change parts of the ship for new parts. And eventually, all of the parts are replaced. The question is, after all of the parts have gradually been replaced over the years, is it the same ship? And some people have different intuitions about this, right? Some people will say it is the same ship, and some would say it is not. This is kind of like that. I am like the ship of Theseus. I existed in 2001, but all the stuff that I'm made out of is different now. But there's been a continuous existence the whole time. So I might be like the ship of Theseus. So again, in 2001, this body that I have now did not exist. So it follows that I did not exist in 2001, but I did exist in 2001. So our first conclusion is that I've got a contradiction here. My supposition, which is that I am identical with this body of mine, must be false. And it follows from that my supposition is false, that I am not identical with my body. What do we think? And Michael's got an interesting comment here. So I didn't know about COVID-19, but I do now. If knowledge is a property of mind, then therefore my mind today did not exist in 2001 and P3 is wrong. Yeah, interesting. Although this is getting into those epistemic properties again. But yeah, I see where you're going with this. Yeah. No. What it means is that, no, I existed in 2001. I was there. It just means that I'm not made of the same stuff. It's not that I wasn't born yet. I don't want to show my age very much, but I was born way before 2001. So, I'd been existing for a few years before that. I'm my body did not exist in the sense that it's not exactly the same. It's like how the ship of Theseus has had all its parts replaced. The ship is still sitting in the harbor, but it's all different materials now. Yeah, your mind has changed as well. Well, continuity of memory. I'm glad you brought that up, Natalia. And that reminds me of what Jack says, Parfit and Locke, two people who have a lot to say about identity. John Locke, who is an empiricist philosopher who came along a little bit after Descartes, one of the British empiricists, he said that, very much like what Jack just said here. Locke's identity criterion was consciousness, by which he meant memory. So even though your body has changed, you have this kind of continuity of memory stretching back, and that's what makes you the same person. Parfit's like a constitutive reductionist, so he's interested in those those more basic kinds of facts, like psychological facts and physical facts, rather than facts about persons, because facts about persons are reducible to psychological and physical facts. So, but we don't need to worry about that. Well, I'd rather not go down the functionalism rabbit hole just yet. But I mean, a functionalist is certainly going to deny that the self is a thinking substance. Functionalists don't really care about substance; they care about functions, right? But that's all I'll say about functionalism for now. So, there's this continuity question here, right? I did not exist from the first presence. So in 2001, I didn't exist. So I did not exist in 2001, but of course I did. So there's a contradiction, which shows that my supposition that I'm identical with my body must be false. So I must not be identical with my body. But maybe it's just a continuity problem, right? This body did not exist, but I can still be identical with my body because the overall, nature of my body hasn't changed. Yes, the material is different. I've got different water molecules in my body, completely different water molecules than I had in 2001. All of the calcium in my bones is different calcium molecules now. The iron in my blood in 2001, different than the iron in my blood now. It's all different iron molecules. But my body's been operating the same way. And the people that, bring it back to the ship of Theseus, the people who claim that the ship is still the same, even after all of its parts have been replaced, make that claim on the basis of continuity. The ship continued to be there in the harbor. And maybe I pull one plank out one day and replace it. Maybe I replace this rope the next day, but it still kind of continues to be a ship. All of the matter is still organized in that kind of shippy way, even though I'm replacing the materials. Same with my body. My body is organized in the right kind of way. I didn't just turn into a bucket of different molecules. I'm still a functioning human body. It's just that the materials that I'm made of have gradually been replaced, right? So that could solve the problem of continuity. Oh, necessary identity. Yeesh. This is where we get all Kripkean. This is a necessary identity. So necessary identity is the idea that if x is y, then if x is necessarily y, the same as y, it's got to be that way in this world and in every other possible world, right? If you know about necessary identity, you've read a little Kripke, you know about the idea of rigid designators, right? Like proper names are supposed to be rigid designators. They're supposed to pick out the same individual in every possible world, right? If I am Josh, if I am identical with my body in this world, I must be identical with my body in every other possible world. That's what this claim of necessary identity amounts to. So suppose again that I'm identical with this body of mine. So by the principle of necessary identity, which is this principle, if x equals y, then necessarily x must equal y. That is, x must equal y in every possible world, every logically possible world. So suppose I'm identical with my body. Then by the principle of necessary identity, I'm necessarily identical with this body in every possible world. But that is false because A, in some possible world, I could be disembodied and have no body, or at least B, I could have a different body in another possible world. Therefore, it is false that I am identical with this body in every possible world. So I can't be identical with my body because it's possible that in another world, I'll have a different body or no body at all. So I can't be identical with my body. So the principle of necessary identity doesn't hold between me and my body. Do you see? Do you understand? Does this make sense so far? Okay, good. Who's not quite clear on this? Maybe that's what I should ask instead, is like, is any part of this not making sense to anybody? Okay, good. Again, this is all like modal stuff. We're dealing with modality, which is kind of like the logic of what is possible in different worlds. So I'm not talking about multiverses per se. I'm talking about a different possible world. But it could be the case that there's another logically possible world where I lose my limbs, right? I can't be identical with my body because in one possible world I have no limbs, and in this world I have all of them. So I can't be identical with my body. I could be in a robot body in another world, or I could have no body at all. So the idea is I'm not identical with my body because there are possible worlds in which my body is either different or completely absent. Next argument. Thoughts and consciousness exist. So there must be objects or substances to which thoughts and consciousness occur. That is, things that think and are conscious. Okay, so far so good. Thoughts and consciousness cannot occur to material things. They cannot be states of material objects like the brain. Therefore, thoughts and consciousness must occur to immaterial things like Cartesian mental substances. And further, mental substances exist, and they are the things that think and are conscious and bear other mental properties. Do you agree? Another rationalist thinker, Leibniz, agrees with this argument. This argument is basically saying that there are mental states, and they occur to certain substances, but these can't be physical substances. And since they can't occur to physical substance, they must occur to non-physical substances. And it follows from that that there are mental substances that must exist because physical things cannot have mental properties. Does that make sense to you? I mean, you're probably used to thinking of the brain being the realizer of the mind. So it might sound a little weird to say that physical things can't have mental properties, but I would put it to you that it is not the brain that has those properties. At least that's somebody who countenances this argument would say that. They would say it is the mind, not the brain. Then again, you might opt for supervenience and just say that wherever there are these physical properties, there are these mental properties which supervene on the physical properties. But speaking of Leibniz, here's a fun thought experiment. It's called Leibniz's mill. Here's what Leibniz wrote. It must be confessed, moreover, that perception and that which depends on it are inexplicable by mechanical causes, and that this by figures and motions. That is by figures and motions. So where he says mechanical, just understand that as physical. Supposing there were a machine so constructed as to think, feel, and have perception, we could conceive of it as enlarged and yet preserving the same proportions, so that we might enter into it as into a mill. Think of a windmill, something with big wheels and gears and stuff moving around. We can see all the moving parts. And this granted, we should only find, on visiting it, pieces which push one against another, but never anything by which to explain a perception. This must be sought for, therefore, in the simple substance, and not in the composite or in the machine. The simple substance for Leibniz was a kind of substance that he called a monad. And monads are the only kind of substance for Leibniz. Now, I'm not going to get into Leibniz's metaphysics. It's too complicated for the time we have left. But he does agree with Descartes. He's not a dualist, but he does agree that we will not find mental properties in physical things. And that's what this mill is supposed to illustrate, this mill thought experiment. We make a thinking machine, enlarge it so that we can walk around inside of it. We wouldn't see any mental properties. We would just see physical things happening. Imagine, to make this a little bit more compatible with the way we think about things today. Imagine, for example, oh, geez, we are running out of time. Imagine, for example, that you could shrink yourself down and go into a brain, like that movie Inner Space. So you shrink yourself down and you go in the brain. Maybe you're walking around the brain, or you have some kind of suit, or you're in some kind of tiny submarine or something. I don't know. So you're in the brain and you're like, okay, person whose brain I'm in, think of the number 3. Think of the color blue. Think of your earliest memory, so on and so forth. Or look at this blue cube, right? You would see only physical things happening in the brain. You would see neurotransmitters in the synapses. You would see changes in electrical potential across axons and dendrites, but you would not see the color blue or the number 3 or the earliest memory. You would only see physical events. And that's what Leibniz is trying to highlight here. What do you think of this thought experiment? Does it make sense to you that mental properties, that physical things can't have mental properties, or do you disagree? Are you maybe an advocate of some kind of supervenience theory? What do you think? Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think I think that the mental does kind of depend on the physical. I mean, um, I guess kind of like a rudimentary example would just be like, some of these concepts can't exist without the physical. Like, we talk about colors, right? Like, I guess there's like the concept of the color blue, but there would actually be no blue if we weren't having these, I guess, physical, or I guess some could argue that you wouldn't be having the concept of the color blue without these physical experiences of blue. So I don't know. I mean, I think that I just think that based on what we know about science, and not to invoke some kind of like scientism or anything, but some of these rules just seem more plausible, I guess, than the dualist counterparts.
Yeah. And that, and remember, Leibniz is not a dualist, but he does have this in common with Descartes, that he thinks that it's just something about the nature of these monads. Like, I'm a monad, my mind is a monad, you're a monad, everything is monads. And they just have mental properties. So he's not a dualist, but he's not a physicalist either. Descartes is a dualist, and Descartes would say, of course, if you look in the brain, you're just going to see nerves and animal spirits and whatever, you're just going to see mechanical processes. It's the immaterial thinking substance that has the perceptions and sensations, that has the qualia, right, and all of that stuff. I disagree. I am of course we've seen that whoopsie daisy, we've seen that supervenience is a possibility. So maybe physical properties and mental properties are different kinds of things, different kinds of properties, but the mental properties supervene on the physical ones. Or maybe you're an emergentist, so you believe that mental properties are an emergent property. That is, they emerge out of the complexity of the physical properties in the brain. Or maybe you're like an eliminative reductionist and you just say, forget about mental properties. We can reduce all of those down to physical properties anyway. These are all possibilities. What does everybody think? Well, if you don't have any thoughts just yet, that's okay, because, this does need a little bit of thinking through, right? But I encourage you to keep thinking about Leibniz's mill. It's a very, very interesting thought experiment, and depending on the answer that you arrive at, whether you agree or disagree with what Leibniz is trying to say, that tells you something about what you think of the mental. That's why we do thought experiments in philosophy. Thought experiments are imaginary scenarios that have multiple answers. And we're not going for a right or a wrong answer so much as we are trying to understand our own beliefs and assumptions. So if you agree with Leibniz, you might not be a physicalist. If you disagree with him, maybe you're a physicalist. That's what this is. That's why we do this. Yeah, emergence is interesting. Aldwin says he can see both sides. Like, so maybe you haven't decided. That's fine. Talia, same. Okay, yeah. So, maybe you can entertain both possibilities and you're not sure which one you believe. That's fine as well. Well, I guess it depends how they're rearranged. Who is familiar with Phineas Gage? The case of Phineas Gage or Phineas Gage. Yeah, the railroad spike. Yeah, he was a railroad worker in the 19th century, and he was like a foreman. So he's supervising and doing a little work himself. And one of the things that he had to do was to tamp dynamite into these holes, right? They would drill these holes and put the dynamite in, and then they'd have this big kind of spiky thing that they would use to kind of jam the dynamite into the holes. And one day there was an accident where there was a spark which ignited the blasting cap, which ignited the dynamite, and you know what happens when there's an explosion in a tube-like hole with a projectile in it. It basically becomes a bullet or a missile, right? So this railroad spike, or this tamping iron, more accurately, it was a tamping iron, shoots up out of this hole and goes right through Gage's head. Now, Gage survived, but parts of his brain were destroyed and maybe rearranged, if you want to think of it that way. And after recovering from the accident, his personality was changed. So yeah, definitely, if the neurons are changed or rearranged, the mind is becomes a little bit different. The mind is connected to the physical. I don't know if I would say connected. I believe that the mind is what the brain does. And we can think of this in terms of emergence or supervenience. Really, either one works for me. But yeah, the mind is what the brain does. So if there are changes in the brain, there are changes in the mind. You don't even have to rearrange the neurons. You can just change how the neurons communicate with one another. And that's what drugs do, right? If you have a mind-altering drug, the reason it has the effects that it does is because the chemicals that are in there are very similar to neurotransmitters that we have in here. And neurotransmitters make they make neurons fire faster or slower, right? That's what they do. They modulate the way neurons communicate with one another. So take alcohol, for example. Alcohol is similar enough in structure to a neurotransmitter called GABA, or no, glutamate. It's similar to glutamate. Or is it GABA? No, it's GABA. I always I get my G neurotransmitters mixed up. The point is, that's how it causes the psychological effects that it has. It's similar enough that it fills in those receptor sites and causes a change in your mental state. Same with other things. Cocaine structurally is very similar to the dopamine molecule, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Opioids are similar to endogenous opioids, like endorphins. And that's why they have the euphoric effect that they have. So you don't even have to change the neurons. You can even just change the way they communicate with one another. You can even do it with magnetic fields. That's called transcranial magnetic stimulation, and we can mess with the way neurons communicate with one another using these powerful magnetic fields. And we can kind of temporarily turn off different parts of the brain with transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's quite cool. All right. Descartes versus Princess Elizabeth. Princess Elizabeth is one of Descartes' students. I don't know if we'll get through all of this today, because we've got less than 20 minutes left now. But Descartes corresponded with Princess Elizabeth, who loved philosophy and was a pretty big critic of some of the things that Descartes claimed about the mental. In the Meditations, Descartes said this. He said, the mind is not immediately affected by all parts of the body, but only by the brain, or perhaps just by one small part of the brain. Every time this part of the brain is in a given state, it presents the same signals to the mind, even though the other parts of the body may be in a different condition at the time. For example, when the nerves in the foot are set in motion in a violent and unusual manner, this motion, by way of the spinal cord, reaches the inner parts of the brain, and there gives the mind its signal for having a certain sensation, namely the sensation of a pain, as occurring in the foot. This stimulates the mind to do its best to get rid of the cause of the pain, which it takes to be harmful to the foot. Later, in Passions of the Soul, Descartes would identify the pineal gland as the part of the brain where the soul interacts with the body. He would say, and the activity of the soul consists entirely in the fact that simply by willing something, it brings it about that the little gland to which it is closely joined moves in the manner required to produce the effect corresponding to this desire. So that's the pineal gland. And what happens again is sort of like a bidirectional mental physical causation where, say I sprain my ankle, the nerves are affected. They're kind of being pushed and pulled by animal spirits, and this continues all the way up into the brain, which affects the pineal gland, which affects the soul, causing me to have a conscious experience of pain in my foot. And that same thing will cause motion the other way, causing me to withdraw my foot, or maybe scream ouch and hop up and down while holding my foot. Right? So it's the sort of bi-directional mental physical causation, the mental being affected by the physical and affecting the physical. And it's a mechanism. It's all just animal spirits and matter in motion from the sense organs and the limbs all the way into the brain until you get to the pineal gland, which is where the soul is connected to the body, according to Descartes. But Princess Elizabeth had a little problem with this. She wrote Descartes a letter and challenged him to explain this. She said, explain how the mind of a human being only a thinking substance, can determine the bodily spirits in producing bodily actions. For it appears that all determination of movement is produced by the pushing of the thing being moved, by the manner in which it is pushed by that which moves it, or else by the qualification and figure of the surface of the latter. So physical things, she is saying, only affect other physical things. Contact is required in the first two conditions and extension for the third. But you entirely exclude the latter, that is, extension, from the notion you have of the soul. And the former seems incompatible with an immaterial thing, that is, contact of a material thing between a material thing. So, Princess Elizabeth is saying, like, look, Descartes, you're saying that bodies are made of extended substance. They're physical, they take up space, they can affect other physical things. And the mind is made of a thinking substance, which is non-physical. So how on earth are they supposed to interact with one another? This is the mind-body interaction problem. This is how Descartes responded. He said, I observe that there are in us certain primitive notions which are, as it were, the originals on the pattern of which we form all other thoughts. So sort of like brute, basic ideas that we all have, primitive notions. As regards the mind and the body together, we have only the primitive notion of their union, on which depends our notion of the mind's power to move the body and the body's power to act on the mind and cause sensations and passions. It just kind of works that way. What do we think? Do you agree with Descartes' response? I don't. Like, I just have this primitive notion that mind and body are separate. He's kind of talking about the dualistic folk notions that Kim began the chapter with, isn't he? But what do you think? Do you agree with Princess Elizabeth or with Descartes? Jack, what do you think?
Yeah, Descartes' response here kind of reminds me of like a little kid asking their parent about something. They're like, why? And the parent just kind of responds like, oh, because. Um,
Yes.
I feel like that's kind of just what he's doing here. Like, I mean, it could just be possible that he, needed more time to really think about this or figure it out. But um, yeah, I don't know. It's definitely not satisfactory.
Mhm. Yeah, I like the way you put that. We could call these just because answers, like, yeah, like, when if a kid says, "Why is the sky blue?" and the parents like, "It just is." That's what Descartes is doing. That's a really good way to put it, Jack. Um, I agree with Princess Elizabeth. Um, Descartes seems to have introduced quite a problem. By saying that the mind and body are two different substances, he's introduced the problem of mind-body interaction without providing a satisfactory answer to it. And Elizabeth, um, uh, kind of is pretty real with her response here. Kind of a mic drop, as I say in the slides. She says, "I admit that it would be easier for me to concede matter and extension to the mind than it would be for me to concede the capacity to move a body and be moved by one to an immaterial thing." This might be the first argument for materialism with respect to the mental. At least that's what Kim says. It's not, uh, because also, we can't forget about Thomas Hobbes, but it is important because the history of Western philosophy doesn't really, we're doing a little bit better at this now, but the history of Western philosophy is kind of forgotten about most of the women that were philosophers. So it's nice to hear from Princess Elizabeth here, um, who was not shy about her materialist conviction. She said, like, look, it makes more sense to me to say that minds are extended in space and can affect other physical things. It's easier for me to concede that the mind is physical than to concede that an immaterial mind can affect or be affected by the physical. So, boom, take that, Descartes. What do you think? What do you think of her response? I quite agree with it. And you can see Princess Elizabeth was, not just a badass at philosophy, but a badass in general. This picture depicts her with her hunting spear. So Princess Elizabeth liked to go out and do guy stuff like hunting. And this is her favorite hunting spear. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think the discussion on the pairing problem kind of leaves Princess Elizabeth behind, but um, I'm not sure we're going to have a chance to get into the pairing problem. Well, let's try. We've got about 15 minutes. Um, so here's the problem. How do we establish pairing relations? Maybe we could do it using this idea of a causal chain. We could also do it with spatial relations. What about a causal chain? A causal chain, remember from one of my previous lectures, we think of causal chains, you know, um, A causes B, causes C, causes D, right? Like the billiard ball example that I like to use. The cue stick strikes the cue ball, which strikes the 8 ball, which rolls into the corner pocket, right? That's a causal chain. How do we establish a pairing relation, like the relation between a mind and a body? Or identifying me with my mind or my body. Can we do it with a causal chain? Does that work? What do we think? If you're not sure, think back to the textbook. This is the point of the textbook where Kim is talking about two guns being fired, and one gun, like gun A, kills person X, and gun B kills person Y. Why do we say it's not the other way around? Gun A killed person Y and gun B killed person X. Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of draw that spatial temporal chain backwards, and you see the bullet kind of would follow back to the appropriate gun, and the gun would have been fired by the appropriate finger, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, we need these spatial relations to kind of ground our talk of causal chains, don't we?
Yeah, like if I guess if I'm here and I like slap the air, we wouldn't say I've slapped you because I'm not like in front of you kind of thing. Like, the causal chain kind of makes sense on its own, but yeah, like you said, it needs that spatial relation. And especially in case I can't think of a case right now, but in cases where you have two of these like similar objects that both exhibit a force at the same time, then in order
Mm-hmm.
to for determination, you need to invoke that spatial relation, right? Like
Yeah.
if two fire a gun at the same person at the same time, then we know who's actually killed them, because if we had the power to, we could see, which bullet hit the heart first, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. So causal chains are important, but I think the takeaway is that they're not strong enough unless we Tula. Sorry, my dog's barking. What you barking at? Come here. Come here, you. Yeah, we need our spatial relations are what help ground all of this. Right. No, no. It's on my keyboard. Okay. Hello, Tula. So Kim says, like, on this basis that we should opt for spatial relations. So he formulates M, this M. It is metaphysically possible for there to be two distinct physical objects, A and B, with the same intrinsic properties and hence the same causal potential or powers. One of these, say A, causes a third object, C, to change in a certain way, but object B has no causal influence on C. How can we know these causal relations? The spatial relations get us there. So just to read right from what Kim says, the fact that A but not B causes C to change must be grounded in some fact about A, B, and C. Since A and B have the same intrinsic properties, in the previous example, maybe we're talking about the same gun. Gun X, gun A, and gun B are the exact same gun. It must be their relational properties with respect to C that provide the desired explanation of their different causal roles. So maybe spatial relations are what we're looking for here. So now we formulate M star. It is metaphysically possible for there to be two souls, A and B, with the same intrinsic properties, such that they both act in a certain way at the same time, and as a result cause a material object, and as a result, material object C undergoes a change. Moreover, it is the action of A, not that of B, that is the cause of the physical change in C. Now, if the substance dualists want to reject M, they have to be able to explain why. So if they want to say that, no, it's not metaphysically possible for there to be two souls that are the same intrinsic properties, and remember that all souls are essentially the same in terms of their intrinsic properties if you're a Cartesian dualist, you have to be able to differentiate how one soul affects C and the other doesn't. Right? But they're going to want to reject this. But how? How do they do this? How could they? What's the pairing relation we're looking for? The pairing relation, how do we pair A with C and not B? That's the pairing relation we're looking for. A affects C, B does not affect C, yet A and B are identical with respect to their intrinsic properties. So how do we establish the pairing relation between A and C? We can't do it with spatial relations because souls are not physical. They're not material. So how do we do this? We can't reject this because we can't explain how. And if we accept it, then we have to explain how immaterial causes can have material effects. And the dualist can't do that. Yes, we abandon substance dualism. I agree. This is the problem, right? If all if minds are just thinking substance, they are all essentially the same. They are all a mind. A mind is just the intrinsic nature of my soul is the same as yours. But we want to say that my soul is affecting my body and your soul is not affecting my body. Okay, how? Well, we can't do it with spatial relations because souls are non-physical. But then if they're non-physical, well, how the heck do they affect anything physical in the first place? The dualist does not have an answer for that, as Elizabeth of Bohemia's response to Descartes illustrates. What if we take our immaterial soul and put it in space somewhere? Not in outer space, but in physical space, like where my body is. We have another problem. Where is it? And how does it interact with the body? Remember that Descartes thought that this interaction took place within the pineal gland. But we can't really locate the mind to any particular part of the brain. It's certainly not in the pineal gland. What would we say? Is the mind or the soul just within a certain part of my brain, or is it in my entire brain, or some other part of my body? Like how Plato thought that some parts of soul were in the chest and the gut. Is some part of my soul somewhere else in my body, right? Kim thinks that wherever we put the soul, it has to be like a geometric point because they're not extended. Minds are not extended. So it'd be something like a geometric point or a singularity or something like that. But then we're faced with the interaction problem again. So even if we say the mind, it's non-physical, but let's put the mind in space somewhere in physical space, we still don't know how it interacts, with the body and how the body interacts with it, right? You can see the problem here, I'm sure. So this is why, and I think we'll probably just finish on this slide and then finish the rest of these slides up next time. There's not that much more to go. Only a couple more slides. But this is why we've largely abandoned substance dualism in favor of property dualism. The substance dualists that are around today do tend to evoke God as an answer to the mind-body interaction problem. There are other philosophers who solve this problem by opting for substance monism. So again, this is not something that Kim really covers here, but somebody like Spinoza would say, look, there aren't two substances. There's one substance, God or nature, right? That's the only substance that there is. And all of us are like finite modes, and we have different attributes. So there's, one attribute might be thinking, and another attribute might be extension. And there's no interaction problem because we're not dealing with two different substances, just, two different attributes of the same substance, right? Or you could be like Leibniz and you could say everything is just monads and it's all like a pre-established harmony kind of thing, right? So there are other answers to the mind-body interaction problem, and if you read those early modern rationalists, like not just Descartes but Spinoza, Leibniz, you're going to see a bunch of answers to the mind-body problem. Whether they work, whether they're plausible, that's up to you to decide. But they solve the mind-body problem by opting for some kind of substance monism over substance dualism, which is interesting to me. All right, I think that is all I will say for today, because we're getting quite close to the time to end the course. So, or to end the class, not to end the course. So the last thing I'll say is, we'll just finish all this next time, and then we'll get on to talk about behaviorism. So for next time, please read chapter 3 on behaviorism. And your quiz is now live. Quiz number 1 is now live. It will ask you questions based upon my lecture for the first chapter of Kim, the introduction. And not just from my lecture. I'm drawing material from the book and my lecture as well. So anything in the book or mentioned in lecture is fair game. Remember, the quiz is open book, but what that means is that you can consult your notes, your slides, your textbook. You may not use Google. You absolutely may not use any generative AI. I will find out if you do. So don't do it. Um, don't copy paste from the slides or the textbook. Answers must be in your own words. Okay, so I hope I'm absolutely clear on that. Again, I've given these instructions now, previously in the course outline, and you'll find them when you begin the quiz. So there should be no confusion about this whatsoever. Yeah. It's open now, and it closes at 11:59 p.m. this Friday. It has 10 true false multiple choice questions, and it has 2 short written answer questions, which should be about 1 or 2 paragraphs in length. Again, all of this is kind of there in the instructions, right? So definitely get that quiz done by 11:59 p.m. on Friday. For those of you that have accommodations, those are already in place. So if you know you need extra time or whatever, if you have academic accommodations, that's all been taken care of. So you're all good. All right. Thanks, everyone. This was fun. We'll finish off dualism next time, and then we'll get on to behaviorism. So I will see you all on Wednesday. Take care.